Okay, well, welcome back again for our Book of Revelation study. We're on week 2, our second session, I guess we could at least say that. Just as a recap, and this is mostly for the fact that I'm beginning recording now, as we've just read out loud through the first 3 chapters of the Book of Revelation. So if you're listening to this on the recording and you want to catch up with us, just read out loud the first 3 chapters of the Book of Revelation. Just go all the way through it. Don't stop and just have a chance to be able to kind of experience, and then you'll be at the same place that we are, which is probably based off from the kind of looks that I'm getting off from everybody here, sort of confused at this point. But that's okay. That's what we are here for, is to take this and to try to crack it open. But I honestly, the Book of Revelation is broken up into identifiable chunks and parts. And this is one of the identifiable chunks and parts. And so I feel like we need to, it's useful for us to hear the whole chunk and then let's go back and pick it apart. Because otherwise, if we try to take it apart piece by piece, we're never going to see the whole picture, right? And then we can come back and maybe be able to see the bigger picture. So let's go at this in a very intentional way. We could start asking try to understand random little bits of information, because there's so many little references and turns of phrase and confusing little pieces of this. But let's take a look at it and try to understand it in a kind of a systematic way. And for that, what I want us to do is we're going to go at the primary questions, right? Who, what, when, where, and why. And at least let's look at these first 3 chapters and try to answer these questions, if nothing else, at least for these first 3 chapters, right? We could ask these questions again, maybe when we get to reading more of the Book of Revelation, but let's at least start with these questions here and just ask them to the 3 chapters that we've just heard, that we've just read together on the Book of Revelation. So let's start with who. And I'll do this, but I also want to just kind of see, I hate to rush forward without getting a sense of, what y'all heard and what, where y'all are coming. Because I've had a lot more time to read this than you guys have. Did anybody read this before you walked in today? Anybody read any of this? A couple people? A little bit, but you didn't get all the way through? Okay. So, again, I could just start talking, but I want to turn this into a little bit of a dialogue here about asking these questions and seeing what kind of response we get, just so I can tell where y'all are standing as far as what you picked up as we were reading this. So, who? Let's just start making a list of who are the people that are mentioned, and how do they? Who are the people that are mentioned in these first 3 chapters? There's a couple softballs here that are pretty easy. Name any character that was part of these first 3 chapters.
Jezebel.
Huh?
Jezebel? Is this
Jezebel's one. Yeah.
John.
John, right? He says, who's John? Right. John is the one who's receiving the vision, right? John is the one who's receiving the vision. There's a couple other details that we know about John. One of them is, John says that I am a brethren with you first of all, he says, I'm a brethren with you, so he's part of the Christian community, right? Because they're all saying, we're brothers and sisters because we all believe God is our Father, right? So he says, I'm part of the brethren, so he's one of the Christian people. That's pretty obvious, right? But he also says, I'm a brethren with you in the trials or in the tribulations, right? So the persecutions that are happening, he is also suffering with the rest of the community. And he's speaking to a community of people who are scared and are in persecution, during a time of persecution. Okay. So, who else did we heard about? We heard about John. What else? What other names or characters have we run across?
Satan.
We heard about Satan. What else? Who else is in this first 3 chapters?
The different churches.
Right, the different churches. So did y'all catch on to that? I mean, that was the basic structure for these 3 chapters, is that there are a series of 7 letters to 7 churches in Asia, right? And by Asia there, they mean the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So what we would call Asia Minor or the Near East, right? So what we would currently call probably the country of Turkey or possibly part of Syria, that's the part of the world that we're talking about, okay? In that time, it was part of the Roman Empire, and it was the first place that started receiving the message of the gospel because it was actually pretty close to Jerusalem, right? It's just up the coast a little ways from Jerusalem. So the first missionaries were there in Asia Minor, and we're starting to establish churches in those places. So Smyrna, let me see here, Ephesus, right? And we've heard about some of these things, right? You know, so Paul writes, and he says, you know, there's a letter of Paul to the Ephesians, right? That's Ephesus. So it was one of the churches there in Asia Minor. Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia. Yes, there was a Philadelphia in that part of the world too. Our Philadelphia was named after that Philadelphia, right? And Laodicea. So 7 churches, right? And so, of course, these are important characters. We don't have names for the people that are there, but they're very important for the fact that, well, if you're writing a set of letters, the audience of who you're writing to, that's important to keep in mind, right? Like those should be, that's an important detail. So 7 communities, and again, when we were listening to it, I asked you to imagine that you were part of one of those communities and receiving this as a message from John, that he's sending it to you. Okay. Who else do we hear of in this letter? Is there any other names? There's one that's probably too obvious why everybody's looking over it. Well, Jesus. Right? It's just so obvious, right? It's just sitting right there, right? You know, Jesus is there, and he's the one who is, and so you caught that this is what happens is John is there, and he's caught up in the Spirit, and he has this vision, and Jesus, he hears the voice of Jesus, and then he turns around and sees a vision of Jesus, and it just drops him to his face. He falls down as though dead. Then Jesus gently lifts him up and says, I have a message. Write down this message for the 7 churches, right? That's what's going on here, right? So that gives us most of the who, right? We're hearing about, there's a couple other minor who's that we're not going to get into right now. So you've got John, he's writing to the 7 churches. Jesus is giving him the message that he should send over there. There's some other minor characters that we hear about. That there are people who are causing disruptions in the community, right? So they talked about the Nicolaitans or the Nickelodeons. Is that the right way to say that? Nicolaitans? Something like that. It's not Nickelodeons. That would be the wrong way to say it.
Kids channel.
But that was a group of people who were pretending to be apostles and teaching the teachings of Jesus Christ, but they were teaching false teachings. Okay, and so when we heard about the false prophetess Jezebel, right? That's also one of the false teachers who is teaching some of the false things. So he's sending them this letter. He's telling them, he's recognizing them, and he's saying that that's the work of Satan, sending out these lies and these false teachings to undermine the churches and their true faith. Okay, so that's some of the other characters that we hear about in these 7 messages to the 7 churches.
Is that almost like communism?
No, the idea behind it was like it was a false set of teachings that were saying something like, it's hard to pin down exactly what they were talking about because we have more. We don't have their writings these days, but from what we can gather, the writings were something like, they were like, well, Jesus was a really smart guy, but he wasn't the Son of God. Okay, that was the kind of the false teachings. They're like, he had this source of mystical wisdom that we should definitely do, but they didn't believe that he was like the Son of God and the Savior in the same way that we would hold as part of the Christian teaching. Okay, so I think we've done who pretty well. We've got a decent list of characters. We know what's with that. What? Again, let's just look at, and this is kind of what here, I'm going to interpret what as, what genre of literature, what type of writing is happening here? What's the different, if you had to put this in a specific type of literature, right? What type of literature is this?
I don't know what it's called, but it's confusing.
Well, okay, it is confusing. First of all, it is confusing.
Right, thank you for that.
Okay.
It'd be more like a letter.
Yeah, it's letters, right? It's a series of letters. It's 7 letters. So, if we want to say what type of writing is this, well, it's letter writing. That's its primary thing that it is, right? Secondarily, it's also a witness to it's the retelling of a mystical event, a mystical occurrence that happened in John's life, right? Because we get both things, right? John says, I had a vision, let me tell you about that vision. So he's storytelling. He's saying, I had this incredible thing that happened to me, let me tell you about this incredible thing that happened to me. So it's telling a story from his own experience, his own life, right? What happened when he was in prayer one day and all of a sudden, he gets this vision, right? And so it's this mystical vision, and he's trying to explain this mystical vision that he's having and portray that. Then also it is letter writing, right? And the letter writing, we can see, this is getting into the why more, but, Jesus is sending this message because he's trying to encourage the people to do good and warn them against falling away from the faith, right? That was kind of seemed to be the message to each one of the churches. It's different particulars for each of the churches, but the message could be summed up as saying, stay faithful, right? Stay true. Don't fall into false teachings and into sin, okay? So it's an encouraging letter, right? And it's a bit of a warning letter, but the warning is meant to be there to get them on the right track, right? So that's like a little bit of what is happening here as far as like what sort of writing is happening here. It's talking about an experience of prayer that was this incredible vision, and then also these letters that that Jesus told him to write to send off to the churches. Okay. We'll talk anyway. Let's go to where. For now, let's go to where. So, where are the things? Where is this taking place? There are a couple little details in here, though. Some of them ran by pretty fast.
Well, he's isolated, isn't he, on an island? John is?
Patmos Island, yes. So that's where he is, right? John is on this island of Patmos. This is sort of like, so remember how I mentioned before that John describes himself as being a fellow member of their community, of the Christian community. He's also been suffering under the same tribulations as them. And he specifically says that I, John, was on the island of Patmos for the sake of preaching the gospel. Which, kind of connecting the dots here, it's like, I didn't want to be here, but they sent me here because I was preaching the gospel, and this was punishment for that. Right? The island of Patmos was not an important or even like really interesting island or anything like that. It was meant to be sort of like sending him off to prison, right? They sent him off into exile because he was being a troublemaker. He was being a leader of this new Christian community. And they wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to get him out of the way. And so therefore they sent him off onto this island, and they didn't give him permission to ever escape. So now he's stuck there, right? And so they think that he's no longer going to be able to be a leader for the Christian community. Well, apparently he manages to smuggle out his testimony, and that gets sent back to the 7 churches. So he's still kind of being a leader, right? But we do see that it's happening on this island of Patmos. I don't know exactly where that is, but I'm sure it's on the eastern half of the Mediterranean, not far from where the rest of these churches are, but just on an island, more deserted
It's
island.
50 miles south of Ephesus.
50 miles south of Ephesus. There we go. So that would put it, in the eastern corner of the Mediterranean. So we've got now that. What else can we say about the question of where? Where are we? Just based off from what we've been reading so far. Right. We're sending, so the other part of the where is not just John, but also who he's sending it to, right? So the where is also these 7 churches, right? That are in Asia. So we have a sense of our place where with these newly formed Christian communities there on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, there in the Roman Empire. John is in this island. He's being held captive there, but he's still managing to be able to send out this message to the people that he received in a vision. Okay. So that gives us a bit of a sense of where. Yeah, that's as much as I'm going to say on that. Although there's more. There's another step to this, and let me say it now. Let me say it now. So very soon, actually, the very next verse. So when you finish, chapter 3, the very next verse says this. Then in my vision, I saw a door open in heaven. So the where is kind of important because the where of the first 3 chapters is he's on Patmos, John's on Patmos, and he's writing to the 7 churches in Asia. Right? We have a very specific, we know geographically where that is. Right? As soon as we enter into chapter 4, and for virtually the rest of the book, everything else happens after he has walked through the door that opened into heaven. Okay?
He went from the island
to heaven, right? Now, how should we interpret this idea of him going into heaven, walking into the door of heaven? I would say that he is having a spiritual journey at this point, right? Everything from chapter 4 forward happens in a new location, and that new location is the spiritual journey of John the Divine, okay? And it's no longer geographically part of our world. He's now in a spiritual space. And it's much more dreamlike, right, than this first part. These first 3 chapters are like, he's having a vision, right? But it's very much grounded in a very specific time and space, time and place. We can identify geographically. We can look on a map and find Patmos Island. We can find the 7 cities. We can be able to find, we know historically that they were there. We can reference those to other historical events that were happening, right? We can say who John is, right? We can identify all of these things. So we have a geography. From chapter 4, verse 1, going forward, the book then becomes, its place is now in this spiritual journey that John the Divine is going to be in, right? And again, I mentioned this last week, 2 weeks ago when we had our last session, about, this may seem very confusing, that the idea of like having a real world setting and then all of a sudden shifting over and jumping into a dream world setting, right? A more kind of imagination sort of place, the one that's surrounded by kind of spiritual thing. But we do have a good analog for this, and we brought this up last time. The Wizard of Oz. right? I'm not saying that John's vision of heaven is the same as the kind of fairy tale vision that we see in The Wizard of Oz, but I'm saying that the structure of the storytelling matches up. The structure of the storytelling, when in The Wizard of Oz, the first little bit of the book, a little bit of the movie, what happens? You find out the real world, right? And then she bumps her head, and she wakes up in Oz, she opens the door, and all of a sudden, everything is in color where it had been black and white before, right? She walks into the dream. Everything that happens from that point is in a new place, right? And it really has almost nothing to do with the world before, right? Something like that structurally, like in the literary way that this is being structured, something like that is happening as soon as we finish chapter 3 and move to chapter 4. At that point, we're going into a mystical vision. First 3 chapters, these are, he's getting a message from Jesus, but he's still in the real world, if you want to say it that way, right? He's still in the geographical world. He could still be able to say, I'm on Patmos, I can see I know where these other places are. But beginning chapter 4, we're not in Kansas anymore. Okay? But we're in Kansas for this week, but then after that, we're not in Kansas anymore. And the rules of how these things work, like all these questions about who, what, when, where, why, they're actually all going to have to change once we get to chapter 4. But for these first 3 chapters, it's the first part of the book of Revelation. We need to ask these questions for this part of the book. Okay. I'm feeling like this is a kind of a big paradigm shift to try to get your head wrapped around. But like, does that start to make sense? There's questions about that?
Well, when I read it before, I never got this out of it. I mean, it has to be explained.
It has to be explained. Yeah, no, it's because remember how I mentioned before, this is why we spent all this time last time going over different genres of literature and how different types of stories, you have to read them in different ways, right? So, we can watch and make sense of The Wizard of Oz, right? But you would never tell somebody, watch this movie because it's a historical documentary, right? You would be very confused if you said that this was a historical documentary, watch The Wizard of Oz, right? You have to read it in the right way. You have to know what kind of thing you're reading. That's why I've been talking about this. And so that's why I'm trying to outline the different, like asking these questions and trying to be able to get good answers off from them. Okay, so that's where. Right now, first 3 chapters, we have a where, and the where is Island of Patmos writing to the churches of Asia, right? After chapter 3, the where becomes we're in spiritual journey territory, and the where becomes totally different. But for right now, we're still in
But
the...
he's still on the island when we go into chapter 4.
So,
Or not?
right. My interpretation of this is his body is there, yes.
Okay.
But then in his mind and in his soul, he's being given these visions that's transporting him to a new sort of being able to see a new reality, right? It's very dreamlike when that happens. But yes, I would say that his body, yes, would still be there. Yeah. There's no indication that he's like physically there. In fact, I think all the clues point to the fact that this is a dream-like experience for him. Okay, so that's where. When? Very sloppy handwriting. When? So, when is this happening? There's some scholarship that's happened around this, and I'm not as up to date on it. I didn't get to go look. I didn't take the chance to go look at some of my books about talking about the scholarship. Maybe even your study Bible will actually have some dates on there. But there's a few internal text clues that tell us when this is happening. Okay, so a few clues in the text that tell us when this is happening. First of all, we know this is in the New Testament, so we know that this is after the life of Jesus, right? We know that that's happening, right? So we've got to be at least past about 33 AD, right? Something like that. But we also know that these are churches that have already been established. And those first churches weren't established until about 2 decades, a decade and a half, 2 decades after the life of Jesus. So we didn't really see any churches growing outside of just Jerusalem and the local area right around Jerusalem until at least about 10, 15 years afterwards. So now we're at least somewheres past the 50s AD, right? We're at least somewhere in the 50s AD.
In my notes that I take notes all over my Bible, and I put 68 AD that I've gotten. It might have been a study on EWTN or
Yeah,
something.
probably. So, but we have to, yeah, and that's true because they also mention, so that we know that there's the churches, and they've been established in these other places outside of the Holy Land, and so therefore we know that we're at least into the 50s. But then it also talks about persecutions. And we see that John's persecution is that he is sent off to exile onto this island, which means that the persecutions are not just random mobs of people. These are government organized persecutions, right? These are government organized because mobs don't take people and exile them off to islands, right? That takes a bureaucracy to be able to come up with that, right? So that means that this is the work that he being put into exile is the work of the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire didn't care about the Christians until after about 67 AD. We have historical records for that. That's when Christianity started showing up on the radar of the Roman Empire, and they did not like it because they said, hey, you have to be one of our approved religions to be part of our empire. And Christianity is not one of the approved religions. Ergo, we're going to have to, anybody who's preaching this and teaching this, we're going to have to shut you down. That was the policy of the government at that time. So they start policing this and trying to get rid of the leaders of this new Christianity thing because they were not on the approved list of religions for being practiced in the Roman Empire. So therefore, we have a date definitely past 67, 68 AD. There's some other contextual clues that happen later on in the book that I think would push us a little bit further than that even, that talk about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happens in 70 or 71, somewhere around there. But that's a little bit less clear. That's happening after chapter 4, and at that point, any historical references are just kind of out the window because we're in dreamland at that point, right? We're in vision. So that's a little bit less clear. So we can definitely say that we are somewhere past 67, 68 AD. Almost certainly we're still within the first generation or two of Christians and Christian communities. So definitely before, we're maybe in the 70s or 80s AD, but anything past that seems too far out. But so we're somewhere kind of in that time frame. Okay, so that's kind of a technical thing. When are we? So if we wanted to have just a quick short synopsis of that, when are we? We're about 40 years after the time of Jesus' ministry. About 40 years. Give or take 5, 10 years, something like that. All right. There's a couple other things, though, we can talk about with when. And they're not so much absolute dating, but they're significant kind of, like in the text, it's telling us there are some certain time frames or time things that are happening. One of them is that John says, okay, here I'm looking and it's on verse 10 or whatever. He says, it was the Lord's day. Let me start at 9. I, John, your brother and partner in hardships, that's the the persecutions we were talking about, right? Partner in hardships in the kingdom of perseverance in Jesus. So he's trying to stay faithful to Jesus. I was on the island of Patmos. Here, this island is, again, the kind of prison island, right? Or at least exile island. On account of the word of God and of witness to Jesus Christ. He was sent there because he was a witness to Jesus Christ, and it was an unapproved religion, so therefore he got sent there, right? It was the Lord's Day, and the Lord's Day here represents Sunday, right? Sunday is the Lord's Day. It's the day of the resurrection. So that's the Lord's Day. And I was in, he says here, the word I have here is ecstasy, or I was in prayer, or I was in some sort of but there's it's a very deep sense of prayer, like praying and then being caught up in a vision, right? So I was in ecstasy, and I heard the voice of one behind me with the sound of a trumpet. So when is this happening? This is significant. We'll keep it in the back of our minds because it's going to show up a lot later. It's happening on the Lord's Day. And when is it happening? Specifically, when he was deep in prayer. All right? So, what's the most significant thing that we would think about that is happening on the Lord's Day? What's our time of prayer on the Lord's Day as Christians? The Mass, right? The Mass, church, worship, right? So all of this is happening in context of, or at least it's referencing to the fact that it's happening on a day of worship, right? And that there's a prayerfulness and a worship that's happening here. And here he's on this Lord's Day, he's encountering the Lord Jesus. Right? Keep that in the back of your mind, because as we go forward, we're going to see a lot of things that are elements of prayer and worship that will be part of the book of Revelation. So it's just when this is happening, it's happening on the Lord's Day. It's happening during a time of prayer. That's background information that we can keep in our minds. One more kind of relative piece of timing. And I don't know if you caught this, but it's repeated. It's said twice. Let me see here. Yeah, verse 1, right? The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him, so he could tell his servants what is now to take place very soon. So when is this? So the when this book of Revelation is happening, right? It says here, this is the revelation, this is the vision, this is the prophecy that's given to John. It's something that is going to affect, he's sending it to the message to them now. He's sending them this heavenly message now because something is going to happen very soon. And they need to know this message to be ready for what is going to happen very soon. In fact, that's repeated a couple verses down where a similar sort of thing is said. Hear this message that I'm sending to you because it's relevant to something that is going to happen very soon. So when we talk about the when, right? When is this event happening? When does the events of this book of Revelation happen? Well, according to the very first verse of this book, these events are going to happen very soon in relationship to the people that it is being sent to. Now, I think this is a very important moment for us, and very something for us that at least what this is telling us is that everything that is happening in this book of Revelation is relevant to the churches of Asia, the 7 churches, and it's relevant because it's something that affects them soon, and it is now at hand. Okay? So why is this so relevant? Well, there are a number of strains of biblical interpretation, a number of different biblical interpreters who have read the book of Revelation, and they've said, and they're contemporary, let me say it this way, there are some contemporary American theologians, most of them Protestant, who they look at the book of Revelation and they say that we are currently in America in the 21st century, we are in the end times being described by the book of Revelation. Right? And they scour through the book of Revelation to find all of these things to explain why it is and how it explains that the prophecies of Revelation are coming true in our time and in our day. Now, I don't know if you've ever run across these. They would probably, I'm sure they've shown up on things like, some of these, so-called, some of these like documentaries that sometimes show up. You run across these on like, I don't know, Christian, television channels, and they'll tell the secrets of the book of Revelation, and they'll tell you about how it's all prophesying, about the things that are happening in now, right? Like 20th, 21st century, world politics or America or something like that, right? Or you might run across it in like there's a series of books, and then they were turned into some movies called Left Behind, right? And it shows up a lot in preaching of churches that are out there. Preachers, big, even big name preachers that are out there. And they're going to talk about the book of Revelation. And they'll say, we are in the end times. We are during, these are the tribulations that are happening. And they'll go through and they'll find all of these things. And they'll say, well, this represents this, and this represents this, and this represents this. And they'll tie it all to things that are happening in the, in the current day. I honestly gave up trying to keep tabs on any of that for a while, because I just came to the conclusion that it was just ridiculous. But I remember when I was younger, it really caught my attention. It kind of scared me, when some of these things would come across. And I remember them saying like, well, there was like the red dragon, and that's going to show up like later on in the book of Revelation. And they're like, aha, communism. Which, now in 2018 sort of sounds ridiculous. But like back in the 90s, Okay. So to the Left Behind series, to this whole tradition that has started, and by the way, it's only this whole tradition that like the end times are happening now, and that you read the book of Revelation as part of like current day, political events and things like that. That's only existed, really. It came out of theologians here in the United States and has only been around for like 100 years or something like that. It has no historical basis to it. Like, it's just, and as far as I can tell, it's really good for grabbing the headlines and making people scared and grabbing people's attention. But as far as I can tell, it is absolute rubbish for the purposes of actually studying the Bible. It's good fear-mongering tactics, but it's absolute rubbish as far as reading the Bible. The first verse of the book of Revelation says, these events are being sent to you, the 7 churches of Asia, because they're events that are going to affect you very soon. The time is at hand. So whatever we're going to do as far as interpreting the book of Revelation, when? Like, what's the timeline on this, right? Its immediate meaning was something that was relevant to the people of the first century AD, right? That's what its original meaning was. Now, does that mean that it has no meaning for us? No, because this book, like so many other parts of the Bible, have universal truths to them, right? So when it talks about like how God will judge and give blessings to the righteous and punishments to the wicked, right? Well, that's not true at this time or in that time or in this place or in that place. That's a universal truth, right? So if I lived in the 1st century or the 21st century, that would be true, right? That would be a universal truth. So the book of Revelation teaches us a universal truth in that. Or what about the way that it talks about, heaven, right? And it helps us to imagine what heaven would look like. It also helps us to imagine hell and what hell would be like, right? Those are universal truths. It doesn't matter if you lived in the 21st century or the 1st century. That's relevant to know, right? That's important to know. So there's universal truths in the book of Revelation. But as far as its historical grounding, it doesn't have anything to do, as far as I can tell, it doesn't have anything to do with contemporary politics or history. That's bad Bible reading. If it has any literal meaning to it, whatever the meaning of this is, it was something that, according to the text itself, was relevant to the people at that time, and that it was happening very soon. So basically what I'm saying is, I'm going to take I'm going to take the Bible and interpret it according to its own rules, not how I want it to sound, right? And its own rule says that this is happening very soon. So when we go forward, and we're going to look at some of the crazier things that are happening in the later part of the book of Revelation, we have to figure out, how was that relevant to the people who were receiving these letters? Because that's the only way that you can really be able to interpret it and keep it to make sense to what it already says is happening in this book. Do y'all follow me on this? Does that make sense? Okay. And hopefully, guys, I know for a lot of people, they're afraid of reading the book of Revelation because they say, like, oh my gosh, it's talking about the end times, and maybe we're going to live through the end times. And then it just seems frightening, to read through it. Again, as far as I can tell, that's rubbish. That has there's no good Bible study, no good Bible scholarship that's happening there. Because you're disregarding the very first verse of this book that's introducing and saying it's happening to the people at that time, not to us 20 centuries later. Maybe one more word on this, because I think it's such a big part of our collective kind of thinking about the book of Revelation, is that it's about, the trials and tribulations, and we're living in the end times or something like that, right? And again, I think that's wrong. That's not the right way to interpret this. But even if, let's say for argument's sake, that, you could argue, and I've seen people do this, right? You could argue and say, well, sure, it says that it's happening very soon, or that the time is at hand, right? But, from God's point of view, maybe very soon is 20 centuries later. Because God's view of history is not our view of history. For God, 1,000 years are as one day, and a day is as 1,000 years. So therefore, very soon for God's purposes might be, centuries and centuries later. So therefore, you could justify reading this as saying it applies to our times, right? In some kind of historical way. Okay. I've seen people say that, right? And let's say, for argument's sake, let's say that's true, right? I don't think that's the right way to interpret it. I think that's stretching the meaning of this. But let's say, for argument's sake, that that's true. Earlier on in the scriptures, in the teachings of Jesus himself, right, from the Gospels, Jesus says, no one knows the final day. No one knows the day or the hour, not even the Son, but only the Father, right? Which is Jesus' way of saying, don't ask me, right? Because that's not, because you're not going to get an answer, right? When is the final day and time? And then he follows up and says, there will be people who will tell you, I am he, and now is the time, right? They're going to tell you, I'm the one who knows when the end of the world is. and follow me because I'm going to be able to give you that. And then he specifically says, anyone who says that is a false prophet and you should not follow them. So even if I believed that the book of Revelation had some sort of hidden meaning to be able to understand how it's part of the new world order of the 21st century and it has all of the, we're in the end times and stuff like that. Even if I believed that, which I don't, because I think it's rubbish, but even if I did, I shouldn't actually try to decode the book of Revelation, because then I'd have to go around telling people, I am he, the time is now, which would make me a false prophet
Oh, yeah.
and an enemy of Jesus. And I don't want that. So any way you cut this, I find this whole business about the left behind and the secrets of the book of Revelation and trying to understand it, that now is the end times, it's bad Bible scholarship. And on top of that, I think it's being used for very selfish motives, because it's getting people, it's fear mongering, right? It's fear mongering, right? You can get a lot of attention, but it's at the expense of truth. And I find that, and I would say, Jesus himself says it, and I would agree with this. That's being a false prophet. And that's making yourself, in some extent, an enemy of the gospel. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking the book of Revelation and reading it according to its own rules, not according to the way that we, that sort of would be a way of being able to get more attention or something like that. And its own rules, its own timing, the when, says the message that is being sent is relevant to the people at that time, and it's happening very soon. So whatever is happening in these visions, we have to interpret it in such a way that it would have been relevant to the people who were hearing it when they received it. Does that make sense? Okay. We're going to be taking a break in a couple minutes, so if y'all want to start pulling some of the stuff out, and I'll finish up here. Okay, last question. Why? And this one, I think, is the one that should be pretty easy to, well, not easy, but maybe is one of the easiest of these questions to answer. Based off from reading chapters 1, 2, and 3, what is the reason for this text? Why did Jesus want these letters written? Why did Jesus appear? What seems to be the message behind these first 3 chapters? There's a bunch of good answers, but I think we can start to identify these things. So why? What's the message here?
To give the people hope
Okay? Hope in the sense of...
of Jesus' hope that he would never leave them or forsake them, that he's always there.
Right. They're in a time of persecution. Their lives are in danger. Their families are in danger. And here Jesus shows up and says, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and the end. And suddenly everything else falls into perspective, right? Okay, what else? So hope. What else?
Sounds like some of those churches have turned evil, or false prophets have come in and are preaching contradictory. And I'm assuming all of these churches started out as Christian. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
They would have been founded probably by, the Apostle John and the Apostle Paul. Paul started the church in Ephesus. We know that. Peter, like these guys would have been the ones who founded it. And then there's these new people coming in and they're giving false teachings.
Yeah.
He talked about forgiveness, to turn away from your sin and that you'll be
Right.
saved, which is
Repentance, right? Which is a good word, right? Repentance sometimes feels like a bad word, but it's a good word. It just means seek for God's forgiveness and get on the path again, right? It's like an alcoholic. It's like get back on the wagon, right? It's like that's what repentance is, right? It's a good thing. Anything else y'all can think of? Just
I think he's telling us always be faithful to him, never deny him.
right. There's a very real sense of warning, and this is one of those. I tend to be just a naturally optimistic sort of person. I don't, so I tend to focus in on the positive side of things. But this book has been challenging me to really be able to say, well, sometimes you have to look at the dark side of things. And you have to be able to say, God's punishment comes because it's like, well, no, don't, this is serious business, I guess is the right way to say it, right? This is serious business and there are serious consequences. So do not treat this lightly.
He's talking to us like he's our father, like a father talks to a son as he's growing up, if you do this, this is the consequences, okay?
Right. Right. And you take that seriously. You guys should take that
it
seriously.
serious.
Yeah.
You may not take it serious till you get a little older and have kids, you see, you know exactly what
story.
the dad was trying to tell you. You should have listened, okay?
True story, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think every single letter starts off by saying, hey, there's this good thing that you're doing, and so let me tell you, about this good thing. I've seen your faithfulness. I've seen your patience, your endurance, right? All these sorts of things, your love and your service. So he'll start off by saying a nice thing. And then Jesus will say, but I have a thing or two against you, right? And we'll use that as an opportunity to offer correction, right, in the face of this. Except for by the time we get, it seems almost as though it's like, he starts off with the best ones who have the best behavior, and then by the time he gets down to the 7th church, he's like, and the good thing about you guys, actually, there's really not a good thing about you guys. You guys really just need to pull your act together. Right? By the time we get to the 7th one, it's just like, it's all bad stuff. It's like, no, you guys, you're really not, That's the one where he says, it's like the worst bottom one, and he says, I have found you to be lukewarm. You're neither cold nor hot, but you're just lukewarm, and I can do nothing with you, right? Because you're neither scared of me, nor are you on fire for me, and there's nothing I can do with you. So, please repent, right? That's the message to that 7th church. So it's sort of like, it doesn't seem to be quite a straight line progression like that, but it does seem to be like, the first few churches are doing pretty good. Jesus has some positive things to say, and then a few corrections. By the time we get to the last churches, it's like all corrections and very little good that you can be able to see about that. Imagine this has got to be a very parent, but also teacher sort of thing, where you're trying to take your student and you're like, well, I'm going to say something good that you did, but then I got to give the correction, right? So it's something like that. All right. So who? John and the 7 churches, Jesus' message, and the false prophets that we've been hearing about. What? It's a series of letters, but also writing down this mystical experience, this ecstasy of prayer that John was having. So he writes that down. So it's both of those things. Where? We know we're on the island of Patmos with John. We're sending the letters to the 7 churches in Asia. But we're also on the brink of opening the door and walking into Oz and no longer being in Kansas anymore. But we know that that's coming up. So, right? When we talked about the importance of the kind of absolute dating, that we're probably somewhere post 68 AD, so somewhere in the, plus or minus about 40 years from the time of Jesus, but also when that these prophecies are something that are relevant to the people at that time, right? That's the other thing. And also when it's happening on the Lord's Day. So it's in the context of prayer and worship and Mass, really. We're going to, liturgy, we're going to get to that. And then why? Because it's meant to bring hope, it's meant to bring encouragement and warning, right, to the people so that they can be able to more faithfully follow Jesus Christ. Okay? So now, all right. So are you feeling better now, after we've answered these questions, are you feeling better now about these first 3 chapters? Yeah. Okay, hey, I'm actually seeing smiles. Good. Okay, then we will take our break for now, and we'll come back for our second part after the snack.